It's already up. Reflections of the bottoms-up thinker. The question that I think is most basic is this: any search for a coherent synthesis of science and theology must involve reflection about how we know what we know. So how do we begin this most basic of questions? How do we know what we know? I'm a bottom-up thinker. I first heard this term from the English scientist theologian, John Polkinghorne, who incidentally is a good friend of Dr. Gingrich, whom we heard a few weeks ago. The first slide illustrates how a bottoms-up thinker ponders. The function that I presented there to you is the degree of evidence, which depends on the degree of confidence, which depends on evidence, and it ranges from 0 to 1. 1 meaning absolute certainty. Confidence depends on evidence. Confidence cannot exist without evidence. Believing something is factual without evidence is arbitrary or superstitious. However, as evidence grows, the likelihood that an idea or postulate is true increases. Evidence is not always easy to come by, but when that is true, we must remember that lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. Let me say that again, maybe with a different word. We must remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That I actually picked up from an article in that magazine on archaeology. We reflect on questions that are important to us and try to assess the credibility of the evidence that comes our way. We are not prepared to pattern our lives in accord with evidence until its credibility and extent have been assessed. As evidence increases, it can reach the point for which it's more rational to believe that an answer to our question has been achieved than to doubt it. We pass through doubt to uncertainty or agnosticism, to faith that our belief is reasonably founded. Coherence and adequacy are the guides in this search. We don't all accord the same weight to evidence because we have different life experiences. Still, there can be a point for which each of us accepts the evidence as sufficient to accept it as a rational basis for the way we live. We commit to it as personal knowledge. Absolute certainty, which corresponds to the degree of confidence of one, is beyond the reach of a bottoms-up thinker. We recognize and we must say, yes, I could still be wrong, but I'm willing to follow what I see as a preponderance of the evidence. There's one exception in the matter of absolute certainty. I know I exist as a conscious being. I'm willing to grant the same to you. I am aware, therefore I am, is a rejection of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, because being aware is prior to thinking, and I don't follow Descartes' reasoning. As a bottom-up thinker, I'm committed to using the same standard in all important questions that confront me, whether they involve science or theology, science or Christianity in my case. Experience is the source of our knowledge. It provides the evidence that guides what we believe and how we live. It provides the basis for belief, the confidence that certain things are so. Some evidence is compelling because accepting it is essential to life. On the first birthday of my youngest son, Tim, My wife Marge put a cupcake with a candle in it on the tray of his high chair. The next 3 slides were taken on Super 8 film, and they are of low quality, but I think they get across the point I'm trying to make. First slide shows Tim thinking the flame was pretty and interesting, and he wanted to touch it. He held his finger out in the flame, but not for very long. As the next slide indicates. The third slide shows a scientist pondering his experience. He hasn't put his finger in and held it in a candle flame since. A point made by the philosopher Michael Polanyi is that we cannot experience everything ourselves. So we must decide which voices we are going to accept as authorities. In this very political year, we have many choices to make in this regard. As Polanyi has emphasized, we have to be very careful about who or what we grant as authority regarding important questions. We're all aware that there are many who believe that the Bible is to be taken literally and that it is without error of any sort. They ignore a lot of evidence. Richard Dawkins is perhaps the best-known atheist. I believe he also ignores a lot of evidence. I'll say more about this later. An image I find helpful is shown on the next slide. It's a puzzle. With some pieces that fit coherently together, but there are no boundaries. No boundary pieces. Those, of course, are the ones I always put in first on puzzle. But in life, there are no boundary pieces. As you can see, I put myself at the center. There's no other place I could start. Being self-centered doesn't have the same content as it usually does in ordinary conversation. It's just that, I get these pages apart. It's just that there's no other place to start. It images the pathway each of us must follow as we seek to bring some order to our experiences of life. I grew up as in a religiously conservative environment. As my life experience broadened, evidence led me to add other pieces to the puzzle. Coherence required that I remove some pieces that I had put down. Those pieces no longer fit the larger picture. This has been true for me in both science and theology. Further evidence may require me to discard yet additional pieces. I've had to pick up some pieces in one of my current science projects. Pam Van Persen, Chair of Mathematics, and I are working on a project to model the wear pipelines by fine particles of sand. We've run into incoherence several times. I think we finally have the conceptual things in order. That awaits this summer when Dan will have time to do the necessary programming. The final image that I use to illumine my reflections on the pathway to personal knowledge is that of a spiral staircase. That's my office. And leads up to the tower that's in our place. Experience and reflection are not circular. New evidence may allow the placement of new pieces in the puzzle that are confirming and add to confidence, or it may lead to new questions for which answers may be found and lead to new knowledge. Coherence leads upward to new knowledge, not certain knowledge, but knowledge in which we can have legitimate confidence. Because life is complex and confusing, and is serial and limited, many can and will remain agnostic with integrity, whether it be about climate change or the possibility of events that are beyond the constraints of natural law. Some of you may know Karen Armstrong, or know of her. She's written a national bestseller, The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness. The last two sentences in her autobiography are these: "Now I have to mount my staircase alone. And as I go up step by step, I am turning again round and round, apparently covering little ground, but climbing upward, I hope, toward the light." Karen Armstrong is indeed a bottom-up thinker. We start with doubt, but doubt can be the growing edge of faith. Faith in either science or theology. Faith is commitment to what we have reason to believe. Here is a vexing example on the science side. Quantum theory appears to have nothing to do with space, whereas general relativity intrinsically involves space-time. Most physicists concerned with this fundamental problem have committed their careers to finding a solution to the contradictory relationship between our two most well-established physical theories. Their rational faith is that a resolution of the paradox will ultimately be found. They have committed their professional lives to the pursuit of that resolution. Perhaps what is called string theory, or one of its descendants, will provide the answer, but we still have no quantum theory of gravity. Their faith is an article of faith based on the history of science. Perhaps this is a point to comment on the difference between contradiction and paradox. To say that a pentagon has 4 sides is contradictory. A paradox is something that appears contradictory, but cannot be because we have good evidence for believing both of the two things that appear contradictory. Einstein's theory of gravity and quantum mechanics illustrate paradox in science. A theological paradox is the affirmation of a God of love and the problem of evil. Much of what is known in science we believe because of the integrated story that has emerged. Thus my image of the puzzle. Many of its elements do not meet the oft-quoted standard of reproducibility. Biological evolution is an example of this. We cannot go back in time. Rather, the picture that has emerged is one that I find beyond reasonable doubt. I don't expect everyone to agree with this, and I'll have more to say about evolution later. Science has taken us beyond what we can imagine. Einstein has given us space-time that can be stretched and twisted. It can even vibrate. Can you imagine space being twisted? I don't think so. I can't. I find the Big Bang even further beyond imagination. Can you imagine there being absolutely nothing, not even space and time? Coherence and adequacy take both science and theology beyond what we can understand or imagine. Scientists know how to get the right answers from quantum mechanics. We know the equations to predict the experimental observations. That's not the same as understanding quantum mechanics. Richard Feynman is considered by many as the most brilliant man and scientist in the 20th century. He has said, nobody understands quantum mechanics. Before turning to theological issues, I want to address the matter of materialism and free will. I don't think there's a scientific mystery greater than that of our consciousness. By this I don't mean the external evidences of consciousness, but the internal awareness that each of us shares. The materialist has no place for our internal awareness. He or she does not distinguish between the mind and the brain. The materialist affirms that all that goes on within us is a mind-bogglingly complex set of chemical reactions. Some processes arise from our internal control systems, but others are triggered by random events. That reduces each of us to being ruled by chance and necessity. Chance and necessity leave no room for coherent thought, and thus no room for rational argument. Rational argument requires some measure of real freedom. It's contradictory for anyone to affirm that mental life is fully governed by chance and necessity, while presuming that his or her own mental life is free to make the denial. This is intrinsically contradictory. Let's ponder that for just a moment, because not everybody is going to agree with this. Second slide is this one. The materialist cuts off the limb on which he or she stands. It's not terribly apparent, but I was hanging on from the other side. I didn't fall off the limb. Since we cannot deny our freedom, limited and mysterious as it is, we must say that brain and mind are not identical. The brain is a necessary but not sufficient condition for consciousness. A book by David Chalmers, The Conscious Mind, in Search of a Fundamental Theory, provides a comprehensive treatment of this issue. If you were to read the book, you would understand why In Search of is in the title of his book. I brought this book along in case I mentioned several books, and I brought them each along, so if you care to look at them later, you may do so. I'm not quite sure that the brain is always a necessary requirement for conscious experience. I have some trouble calling a fraud the reports of spirit travel by some Native American medicine men. Such travel is reported in the White Cloud Journal, once published here at USD. Dr. Gingrich has told us about the very special requirements for the existence of our universe and for the existence of intelligent life. If you want to know more about it, just how special, you can profitably read Peter Ward and Donald Brownlee's Rare Earth, Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe. Ward is professor of geological sciences, and Brownlee is a member of the National Academy of Sciences and professor of astronomy, both are at the University of Washington. The book presents only established science and makes no comment about what conclusions one could draw from these facts. Although not fully compelling, the growing constellation of evidence of special design is indeed impressive. The book is a Scientific American editor's choice. Living systems are incredibly more complex than inorganic universe is, and some have attempted to extend the anthropic principle to make it compelling. They promote their efforts as intelligent design, with capital I and capital D. You may recall Dr. Greenberg's commenting that he uses it without the capitals. Those who make use of the capital letters argue for the evidence of irreducible complexity. The idea is that some elements of living systems need all of their components to function. Proponents of intelligent design believe that evolution, though through slow, random changes that bring about the necessary components at the same time, is just not credible. They believe there is no way parts could come together naturally. This would make the need for a creator compelling. One of their illustrations is that of a mousetrap. Remove any significant part of the mousetrap and it doesn't catch mice. Why evidence does not support irreducible complexity is presented in Why Intelligent Design Fails, a scientific critique of the new creationism. It's edited by Matt Young and Tanner Edis. The failure of irreducible complexity is that it does not allow for indirect pathways to complex entities, such as a bacterial flagellum. Many of you know about indirect pathways, at least I presume those of you who have played pool. A plausible indirect path exists for the flagellum. The human eye also shows clear evidence of indirect evolution. The intelligent design people have a more sophisticated approach to science than the creationists. Most creationists believe in a young earth and a global flood. Many intelligent design people are former creationists. Creationists argue their case using statistics. The odds of even a small portion of our DNA coming to be based on statistics alone is incredibly remote. However, two factors operate jointly to determine what is likely. One is a statistical factor called entropy, but the other factor that must be considered is energy. At the melting point of ice, the more ordered ice and the more random liquid water are in equilibrium. When you heat ice, it's converted to water, and then the temperature can rise. There are two factors, energy and entropy, not just the statistical factor. The relatively new science of irreversible thermodynamics allows for non-equilibrium creation of order. The requirement is that overall, the entropy must increase. We're able to grab some of the energy of the sun because it has a higher temperature. Plants do it directly. We have to heat. Having said this, the amount of information present in the fertilized cell from which you came is really quite incredible. It should be no surprise that many take it as compelling evidence for a creator. Impressive as it truly is, it is not quite compelling. Irreversible thermodynamics may provide a way for the scientists to present a reasonable pathway for this information to have arisen through purely natural processes. Of course, our mind is not governed solely by chance and necessity. Something beyond thermodynamics is required to account for rational thought. We know we have some intelligence, even if we've planned it a mystery. Did this intelligence come about by some natural process whose laws we don't yet understand? That is a question which no one even knows how to find the evidence within the scientific paradigm. However, there is a critical distinction that can be made between the information resident in living systems and that in human language. Human language is compelling evidence of intelligence and purpose. On the other hand, irreversible thermodynamics does open the door for the possibility that the information within living systems may arise through fully natural processes. So how are human language and DNA different? The distinction is that the information in DNA cannot be separated from its chemical structure, and human language is not dependent on any particular physical structure. A word may be encoded in the arbitrary symbols of an alphabet, which in turn denote the meaning of certain sounds linguists call phonemes. Note especially the word meaning. The relationship we make between meaning and the sounds is arbitrary, as different languages illustrate. Furthermore, the same information can be stored in many different ways. Audio tapes, video tapes, CDs. It can be transmitted, Morse code, radio waves, light. I only learned of this important distinction between information that is independent of physical structure and that which is not this December. It's one of my new pieces to my puzzle. This distinction is made use of in 3 essays in the December issue of Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, the Journal of the American Scientific Affiliation, of which Dr. Gingrich is a member. The essential points are the arbitrary nature of coding and the independence of any particular medium for storage or transmission. We cannot get to the word meaning from the materialist perspective. The important distinction between information tied to structure and that which is not allows the Christian scientist to affirm his belief in the existence of God and still investigate the origin of living systems, as our next speaker will, within the boundaries appropriate to science. There's no need to keep what we affirm scientifically and what we affirm theologically in separate compartments in non-overlapping magisteria, as Stephen J. Gould has suggested. A bottom-up thinker can pursue integration of the 2 magisteria with integrity and without paradox. There is room for the pursuit of a coherent picture that includes both science and theology, but only if we make God big enough. Science begins with speculations, so does theology, the bottom-up thinker. The Big Bang appears to require that the Creator exists. The Creator must live in the Creator's own uncreated temporality, unconstrained by created time. God, if God exists, must be immensely greater than we can imagine, and certainly much greater than any had reason to suspect before the development of modern science. Etienne Gilson has given us the words that define a God who is big enough. They bear some reflection, so I have put them on the slide. These words mean that absolutely nothing can be placed above God. He is firstly a definer, the definer of coherence, and thus of truth, beauty, love, and justice. Only with coherence defined do we have logic and mathematics. Is there such a being? As a bottom-up thinker, I have to look to evidence to decide. Let's first discuss what some things would be like if there is such a God before we consider the evidence. If God resides in God's own uncreated temporality, God knows all of time from beginning to end. For God alone, this does not mean determinism as some have thought. I've discussed this point with Laura Meyer, our USD philosopher. It would be strange indeed for God to be constrained by his own creation. Jesus tells us that a sparrow doesn't fall without God's knowledge, and that even the hairs on our heads are numbered. God has a little easier time with mine than he did when I was younger. The import of what Jesus said is that God alone knows all of us, and he is concerned about each one of us. It's quite beyond my ability to imagine a being who has such comprehensive knowledge. My inability to imagine is not evidence that there is no God, any more than my inability to imagine is that there is no Big Bang. As a definer of coherence, God can and has granted us freedom. Logic cannot deny the choice of the Creator to give us this very dangerous gift of freedom. This big God may compel us, often without our knowing, even as good parents do. But his objective is to set us free to be ourselves. He wants us to stand on our own feet as people of character. Coherence also requires that what goes on in this life is only a small part of the full story for humanity. God will ultimately resolve matters of justice. A point that is very important to me is that God is not vengeful. To believe God is vengeful is incoherent. It is in fact an attack upon the character of God. The words in both the Old and New Testaments can refer to punishment. The translation as vengeance arises from a theological bias. I see coherence as requiring that all of God's punishments are redemptive in intent. The love of God is for all of his creation and for all of humanity. That is the gospel. Back to evolution. Evolution is observed to be a random process, and thus a process in which no purpose resides. That is why so many conservative Christians are deeply opposed to it. However, a God who is as big as Etienne Gilson has proposed is quite capable of hiding behind randomness and can be said to do so without any incoherence. Evolution cannot be taken as compelling evidence against the existence of God. The prophet Isaiah has given us, truly you are a God who hides himself. Hides, yes, but a God who also reveals himself, usually quietly, to give us room to be. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, Michael Belandi has underlined the critical importance of whom or what we accept as authority for our lives. As a Christian, there's no escape for me in saying what authority I give to the Bible. First thing I need to say is that there is no incoherence in affirming the possibility of miracles, occurrences that fall outside the boundaries of natural law. Otherwise, we're left with Jefferson's Bible. The Creator is in no way bound by the laws governing his creation. One has to ask if evidence is adequate to make the occurrence of such happenings a reasonable belief. We'll get to that. God is quite capable, the God who is quite capable of miracles may sometimes be rather theatrical. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all report that the thick veil in the temple was torn in two when Jesus died. Even the abbreviated report of Mark gives us Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. The theological import is that access to God is open to all, with top to bottom referring to being God's initiative. Whether this was literal or not is not terribly important. However, Luke reports in Acts, a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Suppose for a moment that the big God I have suggested decided to be theatrical. Then imagine you were a priest serving in the temple and saw the veil tear apart. How would you respond? Especially after you heard the testimony of the disciples on the day of Pentecost. Perhaps the reporting of the tearing of the veil was not just metaphorical. Someday, beyond this scene, you may be able to ask one of the priests why he became a follower of the way of Jesus. Was it the torn veil? Of course, you can deny all miracles and reject what Luke reports. The necessary methodology of science does not include the supernatural. However, such denial is an a priori position. It's not one based on evidence. Luke reports the final words of Jesus as, "You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea, and to the ends of the earth." When it came to the replacement of Judas, Peter had this to say about the qualifications of the replacement. He is to be one of the men who has accompanied us during all the time the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day he was taken up from us. One of these must become a witness with us of his resurrection. In the first letter of the Apostle John, we read, "What we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands, this is what I'm telling you about." My reading and reflection on the Bible and on secular history have led me to believe that this witness is credible. I have considered the alternatives. I do not find the New Testament without error, even theological error. The disciples were witnesses to their experience. This does not mean they had all their theology figured out. They did not, and neither do we today. I believe Paul was wrong in some of the things he said. This view of the Scripture does not drain it of all authority as revelation. Coherence is the essential guide. I'm a skeptical Christian, so I still ask, can this quite incredible story of hiddenness and revelation really be true? It does require a big God. Some comment must be made about what is called the Incarnation. John tells us that Jesus was the Word made flesh. Elsewhere, Jesus was called the image of God. One can safely say that an image is not that of which it is an image. And Jesus was called the image of God. I like to say that the infinite Word of God was projected into the finiteness of human flesh. Jesus was fully human, and by his own words did not know all things. Luke reports that at 12 years of age, Jesus grew in wisdom and knowledge. He had to learn. As he grew, he had to learn the carpentry trade. I have trouble with the joint divine and human consciousness within Jesus that is affirmed in the creeds. With human consciousness fully coordinated with the divine, infinite divine, I don't see how Jesus could be tempted. He was. The creedal view collides with the affirmation in the biblical book of Hebrews, which states, He, Jesus, was made like us in every respect. The essential Christian affirmation is that Jesus was a unique revelation of God in human flesh. I'm not saying that God has not made other revelations. As a unique image of Jesus, Jesus could say, "Have I been with you so long, and yet you do not know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father." This I understand to mean that Jesus, as the finite image of God, revealed what God is like. He revealed all that his disciples could comprehend about this big God. The apostles were witnesses to the resurrection and to other happenings that fall outside boundaries of natural law. I discount many reports of the miraculous healing that have come to my attention, but the context of others makes them more difficult to discount. I'm not one to ignore apparently credible data. I find myself able to affirm that the preponderance of the evidence points to a big God who loves all mankind and intends their good. This is why the apostles call their story good news. What we are prepared to affirm is critically dependent upon our life experiences. Many have not had experiences that can take them beyond skepticism to affirmation. For them, agnosticism is the only position that can be held with integrity. Richard Dawkins and those on the far right theologically are not open to the full spectrum of evidences. Their positions are both arbitrary. My position is at least not arbitrary. I am still reading and reflecting as a bottom-up thinker should. I would be disappointed if at least some of you did not take exception, even strong exception, to what I accept as personal knowledge. My attempts to bring coherence to the evidences that have come my way in science and theology may well be flawed, either because of limited experience or misperception of coherence. As a bottom-up thinker, I must always be willing to listen respectfully. That may lead to my discarding pieces of my personal puzzle that had seemed to fit, but do not fit a larger view. I only present this as a progress report.
Thanks, Howard. Yeah, so I think I told you, Howard thinks about this stuff, right? So I'm recording this, you can replay it 100 times, maybe you can figure out some of the depths of what he's saying here. But I think ultimately, first off, I want to sort of throw out to us to talk about a little bit and to think about. I really enjoy Howard's image of a puzzle and someone trying to assemble a puzzle, because I really feel like that's a pretty good image of a lot of people's sort of, way of attacking and thinking about this puzzle. Like, how do you bring coherence into it? And I know that lots of people I talk to, I have little kids, so I know there's all versions of puzzles, right? And there's the 6-piece puzzle. There's the puzzle that has the actual shape of the rabbit, and you just take that rabbit and put it in shape, right? And I feel like that's a lot of people sort of grappling with this. And I would argue, as Howard's sort of saying, on both sides, it's just that. Like, I have a picture of how the world is, and I just take this piece and I stick it in that spot, right? But I know, our house, we love to do puzzles. So we will do a 1,000-piece puzzle, and I have my 4-year-old helping us with this 1,000-piece puzzle. He can't do very much, except we can find some pieces of a character, and maybe they'll put that together, and that's just a little piece, right? I think it's a beautiful image for this, and I guess I want to sort of start out by just sort of asking you guys to reflect on it a little bit, of what your puzzle looks like. I mean, what do you think are, in part, how complex is this exercise for you, if at all? But more importantly, and maybe what Howard was getting at a little bit, was this concept of the sort of presuppositions that we have, I think, right? So some of us may have come from a very conservative Christian background and have loads of presuppositions. And some other people telling me their stories have gone from that to the exact opposite of embracing a Dawkins atheism, because they figured out that some things weren't really coherent, and therefore this is not working, and snap right into another model. And I wonder if maybe that is the right answer, maybe that is the right model. I don't know, it might puzzle. But I just want to sort of invite you guys to think about that a little bit. and talking about, in part, sort of what you guys think, your sort of journey is on this. I think as a personal reflection would be kind of interesting to start with. So, anyway, I'll give us a breakdown, and I'll kind of travel around a little bit. But I'm going to give you sort of 5 to 10 minutes. You can grab that as something to discuss if you like, or you can totally ignore what I'm saying. If there's something that you guys get out of it which makes you more interesting than that, go for it too, right? But yeah, let's just chat about this a little bit, and then I'll sort of bring us back together too. Okay? If we have questions for Howard, we can ask them afterwards.